Let's raise a glass to the old lady who still thinks Dad's money belongs to her. My son slurred into the microphone on the night of my 86th birthday, and for a moment the entire restaurant went silent except for the sound of ice clinking against crystal. I remember staring at the white linen tablecloth in front of me, tracing the edge of my folded napkin with one finger while 30 people avoided looking directly at me. The party had been Daniel's idea. That was the cruelest part. 2 weeks earlier, he'd called me sounding unusually cheerful, insisting that after everything I'd done for the family, I deserved a proper celebration. 86 is a big deal, Mom, he'd said warmly. Let me do this for you. I should have known something was wrong the moment Melissa volunteered to help organize it. My daughter-in-law had never planned anything for me before. Not birthdays. Not holidays. Not even the quiet Mother's Days after Thomas died 4 years ago. But suddenly she cared about centerpieces and guest lists, and which restaurant had the best private dining room in Columbus. Looking around that evening, I realized every detail had been chosen to impress people, not comfort me. The room glowed with oversized chandeliers that reflected off polished wine glasses and silverware. A pianist in the corner played old jazz standards too loudly for conversation. Even the cake looked more expensive than personal, covered in white sugar roses that smelled faintly artificial when the waiter set it beside me. Claire sat to my left, her expression tight from the moment Daniel ordered his third whiskey. My granddaughter had inherited Thomas's eyes, steady and observant. She kept reaching for my water glass before I noticed it was empty. Small gestures that reminded me somebody at that table still saw me as a person instead of an obstacle. Across from us, Melissa wore a pale gold dress and the smile she reserved for charity events and funerals. Every time someone mentioned Thomas, she tilted her head sympathetically without saying much. But I noticed the way her fingers tightened around her wine stem whenever the conversation drifted toward the company or the house. Daniel stood up suddenly, swaying slightly as he grabbed the microphone the restaurant manager had foolishly provided for speeches. "All right," he announced loudly, grinning at the guests. "I think it's time we toast the birthday girl." Nervous laughter rippled through the room. I saw two of Thomas's old friends exchange uncomfortable glances near the back wall. Daniel lifted his glass. "To the old lady who won't let go of Dad's money." Somebody coughed. Somebody else looked down at their plate. Melissa pressed her lips together, pretending to hide a smile behind her champagne glass. Daniel laughed at his own joke before continuing. "Seriously though, 86 years old and still holding on to every penny like she plans to live forever." A few weak chuckles followed, the kind people use when they're desperate not to embarrass themselves in public. I felt Claire stiffen beside me. Her hand moved toward mine under the table, but I gently rested my fingers over hers before she could speak. There was no point. "Not yet." Daniel kept talking, his words slower now, soaked in bourbon and resentment. "Dad worked his whole life for this family. Sometimes I think he'd be real disappointed seeing all that money just sitting there while the rest of us struggle." The word struggle almost made me smile. Daniel drove a $70,000 pickup truck and lived in a 4-bedroom house Melissa decorated like a luxury hotel. Last Christmas they spent a week in Aspen. 2 months ago Melissa had posted photos online from a spa resort in Arizona, where massages cost more than my first car payment back in 1962. But in Daniel's mind, he was struggling because my name still sat on the deeds and accounts Thomas legally left to me. I lifted my wine glass carefully and took a small sip of Chardonnay while the room waited to see whether I would cry, argue, or quietly excuse myself to the restroom like elderly women in movies are expected to do. Instead, I smiled gently at my son. "Your father always believed money revealed character," I said softly. The room became even quieter after that. Daniel blinked at me, confused by my calmness. Claire lowered her eyes, hiding something that looked dangerously close to satisfaction. And across the table, for the first time all evening, Melissa stopped smiling. The drive home from the restaurant took 23 minutes, and during that entire time Daniel never once looked at me. Rain streaked softly across the windshield while the city lights blurred into pale smears of yellow and red outside the passenger window. Melissa sat in the front seat adjusting the radio every few minutes, pretending nothing unusual had happened. Claire sat beside me in the back, tense and silent. I could feel the anger radiating from her even though she kept her hands folded neatly in her lap the way I taught her when she was little. Daniel finally cleared his throat as we turned onto my street. You know I was joking back there, right, Mom? He asked casually. People are too sensitive these days. I looked out at the familiar maple trees lining the sidewalk in front of my neighborhood. Thomas planted most of them himself nearly 30 years ago, when the subdivision was still mostly empty land. Of course, I said quietly. People say many things after drinking. Daniel laughed with visible relief, eager to accept forgiveness he had not earned. Exactly. That is exactly what I mean. Melissa glanced at him quickly before turning around toward me with a polished smile. Daniel has just been stressed lately. The economy, bills, taxes. Everything is expensive now. I almost admired how naturally she could speak about money, while wearing diamond earrings large enough to catch reflections from passing headlights. When we pulled into my driveway, Claire got out first and opened my door before Daniel even unbuckled his seatbelt. The cold night air smelled faintly like wet grass and chimney smoke. My house stood quietly beneath the porch light, the same white colonial Thomas and I bought in 1978 after years of saving. Daniel looked at the property differently these days. I noticed it every time he visited. He no longer saw family memories or Christmas mornings or the porch swing Thomas built by hand. He saw square footage, equity, potential profit. Mom, he said as we walked toward the front steps, have you ever thought about downsizing? There it was again, always hidden beneath concern. Downsizing, simplifying, assisted living, easier maintenance. Different words for the same thing. Leave. This house still works perfectly fine for me, I replied calmly while unlocking the front door. Inside, the familiar scent of old books and lemon furniture polish wrapped around me immediately. Claire helped me remove my coat while Daniel wandered into the kitchen opening cabinets, as if he already owned the place. The stairs cannot be easy at your age, Melissa added gently. And honestly, homes this size are a lot to manage now. I hung my purse carefully beside the door. Your father climbed those stairs every day until 2 weeks before he died. The room fell quiet after that. Thomas had suffered a heart attack 4 years earlier while watering roses in the backyard. One moment he was trimming branches beneath the June sun, and the next my entire life split into before and after. After his funeral, Daniel began visiting more often. At first I mistook it for grief. He brought groceries, fixed loose cabinet hinges, offered to organize paperwork in Thomas's office. But slowly the conversations changed. He started asking questions about insurance policies and investment accounts. Melissa began suggesting renovations I never requested. One afternoon I came home from church to find her measuring my dining room windows while discussing resale value on the phone with somebody from a design company. The strangest part was how normal they both acted while circling my life like hungry people pretending not to notice food on the table. Claire walked quietly into Thomas's old study, while Daniel poured himself another drink from the crystal decanter near the fireplace. I watched him use his father's glass without asking, exactly the way he had been doing more and more lately. You should really think about letting us help with the finances, Melissa said softly from the kitchen doorway. It must be overwhelming keeping track of everything alone. I looked at her for several long seconds before answering. I have managed this household since before you graduated high school, Melissa. Her smile tightened, almost invisibly. Daniel suddenly clapped his hands together as if eager to break the tension. All right. Nobody is fighting. It was just a birthday dinner. He finished his bourbon and grabbed his car keys from the counter. Get some rest, Mom. Claire stayed behind after they left. We stood together near the living room window watching Daniel's truck disappear into the wet darkness. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally she turned toward me, her voice low and careful. Grandma, she said. I think they are waiting for something. I kept staring at the empty street outside. I know, I answered softly. And I think your grandfather knew it too. The next morning I woke before sunrise the way I always did after difficult evenings. At 86, sleep came lightly and left quickly. The house was still dark except for the faint blue glow from the digital clock on Thomas's side of the bed. I lay there quietly for several minutes listening to the old pipes hum behind the walls while rain tapped softly against the windows. Thomas used to say our house had its own heartbeat. Some mornings I still expected to hear him downstairs grinding coffee beans, or humming old Frank Sinatra songs while reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Instead, there was only silence. I wrapped my robe tighter around myself and walked slowly downstairs, my hand brushing the polished oak railing Thomas refinished himself during the winter of 1989. Every inch of that house carried fingerprints from our life together. The small burn mark beside the stove from Thanksgiving in 1997. The faded scratch on the hallway wall where Daniel crashed his bicycle indoors during a storm when he was 12. The tiny pencil marks inside the pantry door measuring Claire's height every birthday until she turned 16. People who talked about selling houses never understood that part. They thought memories packed neatly into cardboard boxes. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle and stood watching steam gather against the window over the sink. My backyard looked silver beneath the cloudy Ohio sky. The bird feeder Thomas built remained hanging near the fence, slightly crooked now after years of weather. I had just poured my tea when I heard footsteps behind me. Claire appeared wearing one of my old sweaters and carrying a stack of legal folders against her chest. She had stayed overnight in the guest room after Daniel left. "You are up early," I said softly. She gave me a tired smile. I could not really sleep. I noticed dark circles beneath her eyes as she sat at the kitchen table. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Then Claire slid one of the folders toward me carefully. "Grandma," she said quietly, "I need to show you something." The folder contained copies of public financial records, loan filings, and overdue tax notices. Daniel's name appeared again and again beside amounts large enough to make my chest tighten slightly. $120,000. $48,000. Lines of debt stacked across multiple pages like cracks spreading through ice. I lowered the papers slowly. "Where did you get these?" Claire hesitated before answering. "Daniel does not know I saw them. A client at my firm mentioned his construction business was having problems, so I checked public filings last week." I stared down at the documents while the kettle ticked softly behind me as it cooled. Suddenly, so many moments from the past 2 years rearranged themselves inside my mind. Daniel insisting I let him review my investment statements. Melissa repeatedly bringing up retirement communities during Sunday dinners. The strange urgency whenever they talked about simplifying my life. They were drowning, and they had started looking at me like a life raft. "There is more," Claire said carefully. "Last night after the party, I went outside to take a call. Daniel and Melissa were near the parking lot by their truck. They did not see me." Something in her voice made me place the papers down very gently. "What did they say?" Claire looked away briefly before answering. Melissa asked him how much longer this was going to take. The kitchen suddenly felt colder despite the heat running beneath the floor vents. "Daniel laughed," Claire continued softly. "Then he said, 'At her age, it is only a matter of time anyway.'" For several seconds I heard nothing, except the old refrigerator motor humming across the room. I thought about Daniel as a little boy with grass stains on his jeans and freckles across his nose, standing beside Thomas in the driveway learning how to hold a flashlight while they fixed bicycles together. I thought about every fever I sat beside through the night, every school lunch packed before sunrise, every Christmas morning. And somehow the cruelest part was not the greed itself. It was the waiting. The patience. My own son had begun measuring my life in remaining years the way people checked expiration dates on milk cartons. Claire reached for my hand across the table. "I am sorry," she whispered. I looked toward the hallway leading to Thomas's study. The door remained slightly open, just the way he always left it. Suddenly I remembered something he once told me during the final year before he died. We had been sitting on the back porch during a thunderstorm watching rain flood the gutters while Daniel argued with Melissa on the phone inside the house. Thomas had stared out into the yard for a long time before quietly saying, "Money does strange things to weak people, Evelyn." At the time I thought he sounded sad. Now I realized he had sounded prepared. After Claire left that afternoon, I carried my tea into Thomas's study and closed the door behind me for the first time in months. The room still looked almost exactly the way he left it. His reading glasses rested beside a yellow legal pad covered in careful handwriting. Framed photographs lined the bookshelf beside old business awards from the hardware stores he spent 40 years building. Even now I could almost hear the soft scrape of his fountain pen against paper, or the low hum of baseball games he listened to on the radio during tax season. I sat down slowly in his leather chair and looked out the window toward the backyard. Thomas always said people revealed themselves gradually, not through grand betrayals but through repeated small choices. Looking back, I realized Daniel and Melissa had been revealing themselves for years. I simply refused to see it while Thomas was alive because he softened every sharp edge in this family. He covered tension with humor. He solved problems quietly before they spread. Without him, everything hidden rose slowly to the surface like cracks appearing beneath old paint. The first strange moment happened 6 months after the funeral. Daniel came over one Saturday carrying coffee and donuts, unusually cheerful. We sat at the kitchen table while sunlight streamed through the curtains. Thomas picked out himself back in 1982. Halfway through breakfast, Daniel casually asked whether I had updated my will recently. I remember laughing softly because the question felt so sudden. Your father handled most of those things before he passed, I told him. Daniel nodded too quickly. Right. I just mean at your age, it is important to keep things organized. At the time I thought it sounded awkward but harmless. A son worrying about practical matters. A few weeks later Melissa arrived carrying brochures from 3 different retirement communities outside Columbus. She spread them across my dining room table beside my untouched lunch, as if presenting vacation options. Look how beautiful these places are, she said brightly. Fitness centers, gardens, 24-hour staff. It could really simplify your life. I remember staring at glossy photographs of smiling elderly couples playing shuffleboard, while my wedding china sat in the cabinet behind her. My life does not need simplifying, I answered politely. Melissa smiled without warmth. Everybody says that at first. Little things kept happening after that. Melissa hired cleaners for my house without asking me. Daniel insisted I give him spare keys in case of emergencies. One afternoon I discovered somebody had removed several boxes from the attic labeled Thomas' personal records. Daniel claimed he was trying to help organize clutter, but he could not explain why the boxes suddenly disappeared into his garage for 3 weeks before quietly returning. Claire noticed changes too. She started visiting more often after catching Melissa photographing rooms inside my house on her phone. Probably for decorating ideas, Melissa said smoothly when Claire questioned her. But Claire told me later there had been measuring tape hanging from Melissa's purse that afternoon. The worst moments were always the smallest ones. Those were the moments that stayed with me at night. Daniel interrupting me halfway through stories as if my memories took too long. Melissa correcting me in front of waiters whenever I forgot minor details. The two of them exchanging quick glances whenever I mentioned feeling tired, almost hopeful for a second before hiding it behind concern. One evening during dinner at their house, Melissa placed a pill organizer beside my plate in front of guests I barely knew. We just worry because Evelyn gets forgetful sometimes, she said sweetly while refilling wine glasses. I had forgotten one appointment with my dentist 3 months earlier. That single mistake suddenly became family mythology. Daniel immediately added stories about me repeating recipes or misplacing mail. Everyone laughed gently the way people do when discussing aging relatives they already consider halfway gone. I remember gripping my fork tightly beneath the table while pretending not to notice. The strange thing about humiliation is how quietly it enters a room. Nobody raises their voice. Nobody calls it cruelty. They wrap it in concern and patience and careful smiles until even you begin questioning yourself. Sitting alone in Thomas's study that afternoon, I opened the bottom drawer of his desk searching for an old photograph album. Instead my fingers brushed against a sealed manila envelope with my name written across the front in Thomas's handwriting. Evelyn. Private. My chest tightened slightly as I stared at the envelope resting in my lap. Outside, wind rattled branches against the windowpane while the house settled softly around me. For a long moment I simply sat there holding it, suddenly understanding why Thomas had sounded so tired during that thunderstorm conversation on the porch. He had already seen the storm coming long before I did. My hands remained steady as I opened the envelope, but something deeper inside me had already begun trembling. Thomas always folded important papers with sharp, precise corners, and this envelope was no different. Inside were several documents clipped neatly together along with a short handwritten letter dated 8 months before his death. I recognized immediately that it had been written during the period when his health first started failing, When he began waking in the middle of the night thinking I was asleep beside him, the paper smelled faintly of cedar and old ink. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then something happened that confirmed the worries I could never fully explain while I was alive. I stopped reading for a moment and closed my eyes. Outside the study window, the wind pushed dead leaves across the patio Thomas built the summer Daniel graduated high school. I remembered how proud Thomas looked that day, standing shirtless in the July heat with sawdust on his jeans while Daniel helped him stain the wood. For years Thomas believed hard work and love could fix almost anything. Toward the end, I think he finally realized some people simply learned how to hide their hunger better than others. I continued reading slowly. Daniel is my son and I love him. But love does not blind me anymore. Melissa encourages the worst parts of him. Together they have become impatient people. Impatient people make dangerous choices around money. My throat tightened slightly. Attached behind the letter were legal documents bearing the name of Walter Green, Thomas's longtime attorney and closest friend since college. One paper contained detailed instructions regarding the family trust and property ownership. Another outlined conditions connected to inheritance distributions after my death. But one paragraph stood out immediately. If any beneficiary attempts to pressure, manipulate, coerce, or falsely declare Evelyn Harper mentally incompetent in order to obtain accelerated access to assets or property, that beneficiary forfeits all inheritance rights permanently. I read the sentence 3 times before setting the papers down carefully on the desk. The room felt impossibly quiet. Then I noticed another note clipped to the back in Thomas's handwriting. Walter knows everything. Trust Claire. Do not confront them too early. That final sentence lingered in my mind long after I finished reading. Do not confront them too early. Thomas had known this would become a waiting game. A test of patience. I leaned back slowly in his chair and stared toward the bookshelf where Daniel's childhood baseball trophies still sat untouched beside framed family photographs. It is a strange feeling realizing the person who understood your family best is the one no longer alive to protect it. The telephone rang downstairs just after noon. I folded the documents carefully back into the envelope before answering. Melissa's bright voice filled the kitchen almost immediately. Evelyn, I was thinking about you this morning. Of course she was. That is kind of you, I answered softly. I hope you are resting after the party. Daniel feels terrible about drinking too much. I pictured her standing inside her spotless kitchen with manicured nails wrapped around an expensive coffee mug while rehearsing concern. People reveal themselves differently after alcohol, I said calmly. A brief silence followed. Well, Melissa replied lightly, stress has really been affecting him lately, especially with finances and business pressure. There it was again. The setup. The careful planting of financial desperation like seeds scattered before a storm. I see, I answered. Actually, she continued, Daniel wanted to stop by tomorrow to discuss a few practical things with you. Nothing serious. Just future planning. Future planning. Another soft phrase carrying sharp intentions underneath. I looked toward Thomas's study door while tracing the edge of the kitchen counter with one finger. Tomorrow should be fine, I said quietly. That evening Claire arrived carrying takeout containers from my favorite Italian restaurant downtown. We ate together at the dining room table beneath the chandelier Thomas installed himself 35 years earlier. Halfway through dinner I slid the envelope across the table toward her. Claire read every page slowly, her expression hardening with each document. When she finished, she looked up at me with eyes suddenly full of understanding. Grandpa knew, she whispered. Yes, I answered softly. I think he knew for a very long time. Claire sat back heavily in her chair staring toward the dark windows. What are you going to do? She asked after a while. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate before answering. Nothing dramatic. The words surprised even me with how calm they sounded. Your grandfather was right. This requires patience. Claire studied my face for several long seconds. Then, for the first time since the birthday dinner, she smiled faintly. They think you are fragile, she said quietly. I glanced toward the hallway where family photographs lined the walls leading upstairs. That, I replied softly, may turn out to be their biggest mistake. Daniel arrived the next afternoon carrying grocery bags and wearing the careful expression people use at hospitals and funerals. Concerned, patient, slightly rehearsed. Through the front window I watched him pause at the driveway before stepping out of his truck, smoothing wrinkles from his shirt as if preparing for a business meeting instead of visiting his mother. Melissa followed behind him holding a paper coffee tray from the expensive cafe near their neighborhood. They looked polished and rested, the way people do when they believe circumstances are finally turning in their favor. I opened the front door before they knocked. "You did not have to bring anything," I said softly while Daniel kissed my cheek quickly. "Just trying to help out more," he answered. "You should not be handling everything alone anymore." There was that word again. Alone. They always spoke as though independence was a temporary condition that needed correcting. Melissa handed me a latte with a bright smile. "Oat milk. Extra cinnamon. Your favorite." I thanked her and led them into the kitchen. The grocery bags contained soup, fruit, bottled water, and several frozen dinners labeled low sodium. Melissa immediately began rearranging items inside my refrigerator without asking where anything belonged. Daniel leaned against the counter glancing around the room with restless eyes. "This place feels bigger every year," he said casually. "Too much house for one person." I stirred my coffee slowly. "Funny. It never felt too big when your father was alive." An awkward silence settled briefly before Melissa stepped in. Smoothly. "That is actually what we wanted to talk about today." Daniel straightened slightly beside her, relieved she had taken control of the conversation. Melissa sat across from me at the kitchen table and folded her hands together with professional calm. "We worry about you, Evelyn. Truly." I noticed she only used my first name during serious conversations involving money. "You have had a few forgetful moments lately, and Daniel thinks maybe it is time we discuss long-term plans." I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "What sort of plans?" Daniel exhaled heavily as though this conversation exhausted him already. "Mom, nobody is trying to upset you. But realistically, you are 86 years old." He paused carefully. "Things happen fast at this age." I looked down at the steam rising from my cup. It fascinated me how people became gentler with their voices exactly when they intended to say something cruel. Melissa reached into her purse and removed a glossy folder from a retirement community 30 miles outside Columbus. "We visited this place recently," she explained brightly. "It is beautiful. Restaurant dining, transportation services, medical staff on site 24 hours a day." She slid photographs toward me across the table. Smiling elderly residents posed beside flower gardens and fireplaces, while soft instrumental music played from hidden speakers somewhere inside the brochure office where those pictures were taken. Every image felt staged, temporary, like hotel advertisements pretending loneliness could be decorated away. "I already have a home," I said quietly. Daniel rubbed his forehead impatiently. "Mom, please stop making this difficult." Difficult. Another revealing word. Not painful. Not emotional. Difficult. As though my attachment to the house Thomas built our life inside represented an inconvenience standing between them and something they wanted. Melissa leaned forward sympathetically. "Nobody is saying immediately. But we should prepare before there is some kind of emergency or confusion later." I noticed the way she emphasized confusion, testing the word carefully, watching my reaction. I lowered my eyes toward the brochure again and deliberately let several long seconds pass before speaking. "Perhaps you are right," I murmured softly. Both of them froze almost imperceptibly. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Melissa before sitting down across from me. "Really?" he asked cautiously. I nodded slowly while tracing the edge of the brochure with one finger. "I have been feeling more tired lately. Sometimes I forget where I put things." Melissa's posture relaxed instantly. Daniel leaned back in visible relief. In that moment I finally understood what Thomas meant about weak people becoming impatient around money. They had been waiting so long for resistance that surrender almost excited them. "That is completely normal," Melissa said warmly. "And honestly, this is the smart decision." I looked up at them with what I hoped resembled uncertainty. "Would you help me figure everything out?" Daniel reached across the table and squeezed my hand quickly. "Of course we will, Mom." His voice softened with something dangerously close to triumph. I smiled faintly and lowered my eyes again before either of them could study my face too carefully. Across the kitchen, the old wall clock ticked steadily above the pantry door while sunlight moved slowly across the hardwood floor. For the first time since Thomas died, I realized I was no longer reacting to events inside my own life. I was watching them unfold exactly the way he predicted they would. Over the next 3 weeks, I became a quieter version of myself. Not dramatically different. Just enough. Enough for Daniel and Melissa to notice what they wanted to notice. I repeated small questions occasionally. I pretended to forget where I left my reading glasses even when they were sitting directly beside me. Twice I intentionally mixed up appointment times while Melissa was present. Each mistake landed exactly the way Thomas predicted it would. Not with concern. With excitement carefully disguised as concern. Melissa started speaking slower around me, her voice coated in exaggerated patience. Daniel began finishing my sentences before I completed them. One afternoon he corrected me about the year Claire graduated law school even though I had been right. "Mom, that was 2016, not 2015, he said gently while exchanging a glance with Melissa across the kitchen island. I apologized softly and watched satisfaction flicker briefly across his face before disappearing again. It amazed me how quickly people accepted weakness when weakness benefited them. Claire hated every moment of it. "I cannot believe they are falling for this," she whispered one evening while helping me water plants in the backyard. The October air smelled like dry leaves and chimney smoke. "They are not falling for it," I answered quietly. "They are choosing to believe it." That was the important difference. Daniel and Melissa needed me fragile. Needed me uncertain. Needed me old in the most convenient way possible. The stronger I appeared, the longer they had to wait. But a confused old woman could be guided, managed, protected. The language around me changed completely once they thought I was slipping. Decisions became discussions held slightly out of my presence. Melissa started answering questions directed toward me at restaurants. Daniel insisted on driving me everywhere even when I still drove perfectly fine. "Traffic is stressful at your age," he explained while pocketing my spare car keys one afternoon without asking. The strange thing was how calm I felt watching it happen. Once you finally understand somebody's intentions, fear disappears. Patterns become visible everywhere. I noticed Daniel checking property value websites on his phone, while pretending to watch football games in my living room. I noticed Melissa taking photographs inside the house more openly now, especially of the kitchen and upstairs bathrooms. One Sunday I overheard them discussing renovation costs quietly in the dining room, while they thought I was napping upstairs. "If we open this wall," Melissa whispered, "the whole first floor would feel modern." Not if. When. In their minds, my absence had already become part of the renovation plan. Claire documented everything carefully. Dates. Comments. Witnesses. Walter Green advised us both to remain patient a little longer. "Pressure reveals character faster than confrontation," he told me. During a private meeting at his office downtown. Walter looked older now than I remembered, his silver hair thinner around the temples, but his voice remained steady and sharp. Thomas understood that better than anyone. He handed me copies of additional trust documents while lowering his glasses slightly. "Legally, they still have time to step back from this." I almost smiled. "Do you think they will?" Walter studied me quietly for several seconds before answering. No. 3 days later Daniel arrived unexpectedly carrying folders from the retirement community. "Just informational stuff," he said casually while spreading papers across my kitchen table. Melissa sat beside him nodding sympathetically. The documents included medical evaluations, housing contracts, and preliminary financial disclosures. My eyes lingered on one section labeled Transfer of Primary Residence Assets. "This seems very sudden," I murmured softly. Daniel leaned forward immediately. "Mom, this is exactly why we should start preparing now while you can still make clear decisions." Still. Such a small word. Such a revealing one. Melissa reached for my hand gently. "Nobody wants strangers making choices for you later." There it was. The first real test. The first careful mention that my ability to decide things might someday disappear. I lowered my eyes toward the paperwork and deliberately hesitated long enough for anticipation to build between them. Then I nodded faintly. "Perhaps you are right," I whispered. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose like a man finally reaching shore after years at sea. Melissa's entire posture softened with relief. Neither of them noticed Claire standing silently near the hallway entrance holding her phone at chest level. They were too focused on the finish line to realize somebody had started recording the race. The meeting took place on a gray Thursday morning inside Walter Green's office overlooking downtown Columbus. Rain pressed softly against the tall windows while traffic moved below in slow lines of silver and red. Daniel arrived wearing a navy suit I had not seen since Claire's law school graduation. Melissa carried a leather folder against her chest and smiled at the receptionist with polished confidence. They both looked like people preparing to finalize a business deal. Claire sat beside me quietly near the end of the long conference table while Walter organized documents into careful stacks beneath the warm yellow light hanging overhead. Daniel leaned toward me before the meeting began and lowered his voice gently. "This is just paperwork, Mom. Nothing stressful." I nodded faintly and folded my hands in my lap. "I appreciate you helping me." The satisfaction that crossed his face lasted only a second, but I still caught it. Walter finally cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Thank you all for coming." His calm voice filled the room evenly. "We are here today because certain concerns have recently been raised regarding Mrs. Harper's long-term care and estate planning." Melissa immediately adopted an expression of sympathetic concern. "We only want what is best for Evelyn," she said softly. Walter gave a small nod before opening the first folder. "Of course." He turned toward Daniel. "You recently requested preliminary documents related to financial guardianship and residential transfer options. Is that correct?" Daniel straightened confidently in his chair. "Yes. My mother has become increasingly forgetful, and we are trying to plan responsibly before things become worse." Claire remained perfectly still beside me. Walter looked down briefly at several papers before speaking again. "I see." Then he reached for another folder entirely. "There is something all of you should review first." The room grew noticeably quieter as Walter slid copies of Thomas's trust provisions across the table. Melissa's smile faded slightly while Daniel scanned the first page with growing confusion. Walter folded his hands together calmly. "Several years ago, Thomas Harper added a protective clause to the family trust." Daniel frowned. "Protective clause?" Walter nodded once. "Yes. Specifically concerning any attempt to pressure, manipulate, or falsely portray Evelyn Harper as mentally incompetent for financial gain." Silence settled heavily across the room. Rain tapped softly against the windows while Daniel reread the paragraph a second time. Melissa's posture stiffened beside him. Walter continued speaking with measured calm. "If such behavior occurred, the responsible beneficiary would permanently forfeit all inheritance rights connected to the Harper estate." Daniel laughed suddenly too loudly. "That is ridiculous. Nobody is manipulating anybody." Walter slowly removed another document from the folder. "Ordinarily that would be difficult to prove," he said evenly. "However, additional evidence was recently provided." Claire finally reached into her purse and placed her phone carefully on the table. She pressed play without saying a word. Daniel's own voice filled the office almost immediately. "At her age, it is only a matter of time anyway." Then Melissa's voice followed discussing property renovations after I moved out of the house. Another recording captured Daniel describing me as confused while pressuring me to sign retirement paperwork. With every passing second, the color drained further from his face. Melissa stared at the table motionless, her hands clenched tightly together. When the recordings ended, nobody spoke for several long moments. Walter finally closed the folder gently. "Based on these recordings, witness documentation, and the language within the trust, both Daniel Harper and Melissa Harper are hereby removed from all inheritance distributions effective immediately." Daniel pushed back from the table abruptly. "Mom, you knew about this?" His voice cracked with disbelief more than anger. I looked at him quietly across the polished wood table. For the first time in months, I allowed my posture to straighten fully. "Your father understood people better than you realized," I said softly. Daniel stared at me as though seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Not weak, not confused, not waiting quietly to disappear. Daniel called me 17 times during the first 2 days after the meeting. I let the phone ring every time while autumn rain drifted softly against the windows of the house he once believed would soon belong to him. By the third day, the messages changed from anger to apology. He blamed stress, debt, alcohol, misunderstandings. Melissa left one voicemail crying quietly and insisting they only wanted to protect me. I listened to each message once before deleting it calmly. There are moments in life when people finally reveal who they truly are. And once that curtain falls, it never fully closes again. A week later, Claire came over carrying grocery bags and a folder from Walter Green's office. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon bread from the bakery downtown, while afternoon sunlight spread across the hardwood floors in long golden strips. For the first time in years, the house felt peaceful instead of watched. Claire unpacked apples beside the sink, while I signed several documents transferring a large portion of Thomas's estate into a scholarship foundation for trade school students across Ohio. Thomas always believed people look down on honest work too easily. The world still needs people who know how to build things, he used to say while teaching Daniel how to replace cabinet hinges or repair fence posts in the backyard. It felt right honoring that part of him instead of feeding the greed that followed his death. Claire would oversee the foundation with Walter's guidance. When I told her, tears filled her eyes almost immediately. "Grandma, this is too much responsibility," she whispered. I smiled softly while signing the final page. "That is exactly why you deserve it." Daniel showed up unannounced 3 days later just before sunset. Through the front window, I watched him stand on the porch with his hands buried inside his coat pockets while cold wind moved through the maple trees along the sidewalk. He looked older somehow. Smaller. I opened the door but did not invite him inside. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he glanced past me into the hallway where family photographs still lined the walls exactly as they always had. "I made mistakes," he said quietly. "More than mistakes," I answered softly. He lowered his eyes after that. The silence between us carried decades inside it. Birthday parties, fishing trips, school concerts, Christmas mornings beside fireplaces and overflowing wrapping paper. Grief does strange things to families, but greed finishes what grief begins. "Melissa left," he admitted finally. "She moved in with her sister last week." I nodded once without surprise. People held together by money rarely survive once money disappears. Daniel rubbed his face tiredly. "I never thought things would go this far." I studied him carefully, standing beneath the porch light Thomas installed 20 years earlier. My son. My only child. A man who once cried because he accidentally stepped on a bird's nest at age 9. Time changes people slowly enough that sometimes mothers do not notice until the transformation is complete. "Your father loved you very much," I said quietly. "That was never the problem." Daniel swallowed hard but said nothing. I could see he wanted forgiveness more than understanding. But those are not always the same thing. After a while, he nodded faintly and stepped backward off the porch. "Take care of yourself, Mom." The strange thing was that he sounded sincere for the first time in years. I watched his truck disappear slowly down the street beneath the fading orange sky. Then I closed the front door and locked it gently behind me. Later that evening, Claire and I ate dinner together in the dining room while soft jazz played from the old radio beside the fireplace. Candlelight reflected against the crystal glasses Thomas and I bought during our 25th anniversary trip to Vermont. Outside, wind moved quietly through the trees while the house settled around us with familiar creaks and whispers. Claire laughed at something I said, and for a brief moment the sound filled every empty corner grief had left behind. After dinner, I carried my tea onto the back porch and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders against the cold. The night air smelled like rain and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed softly through the dark Ohio hills. I sat there alone beneath the porch light Thomas built with his own hands and realized something surprising. They thought age made me fragile because my hair turned white and my hands moved slower now. But age had given me something far more dangerous than strength. It gave me patience long enough to see people clearly.